Well, thanks very much for having me here today. What I'm going to try and do is just kind of sketch out a kind of like a thought exercise that responds to the question that I think is there on the programme, that addresses power as such and tries to theorise power as such, how power is experienced, how power can be encountered and met with and resisted. I can't really remember what the paper was originally called, but I gave this talk about a month ago in Dumfries, and there it was called Nothing is Taking Place But the Place Itself, Slavoj Žižek's Anxious Anarchism. So that's what I'm going to call it. I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear what people make of Žižek. I don't know how familiar people are with Žižek, but I always thought, like, because I'm just coming up to start a PhD, I always thought, like, about 6 months ago when the time came to start doing conferences and stuff, I wasn't really sure when the conferences started coming how much of a Žižekian I would be, but it's turned out that every time one comes along, I find myself, when I'm given 15 or 20 minutes to speak, that it's Žižek that I do. So I must be a kind of a Žižekian. So in the discussion after, I would be fascinated to hear what people think of the kind of ideas that I'll try and develop. For me, Žižek comes up with a really penetrating response to the question, what is power? Is it all-consuming? Or can it be met with, can it be engaged with? I think that he comes up with some fascinating responses. It's quite hard to develop these ideas, so I'll try my best, and I know a few ways to kind of approach it slowly and even for myself, you know, using metaphors and so on. That's you know, with post-structuralist stuff, that's kind of, sometimes you can only approach these things slowly, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see how the ideas develop, and we'll see what kind of ideas come out of that. The first way really that I want to approach Žižek is by bringing up someone who I would consider maybe Žižek's opposite. I did my MA dissertation on Batman 3, and it was really good fun, like read with Hegel and stuff like that. My supervisor said, go away and read this guy called Roberto Mangabeira Unger. Now, I don't know where Torsten is, but Torsten might know. Oh, he's not here. But if there's any economists in the room, they might know this guy, Roberto Mangabeira Unger. The idea that I'll bring out as belonging to him is very commonsensical, but just to put a name to it. Unger has been, I think still is sometimes, an advisor to Obama. He's made several speculative bids for the Brazilian presidency, and he's a very prolific economist and so on. But as I say, the idea that I bring up as belonging to him is very commonsensical, and we've all heard it, and I hope that you agree. Let me see if I can get this image up. Yeah, that's cool. So the image that's about to come up is from a Weimar, Germany piece of cinema called Metropolis by Fritz Lang. I think it was 1927. And the basic idea there is that it's a stratified, spatially stratified society where the elite academics and the kind of the gentry, if you like, live in this idyllic garden paradise right at the top. The workers live in this kind of cavernous, like subterranean, industrial, like region below, and life's bad. And it's a very long film, and this is the ending. That the workers and the gentry manage to. This is a kind of a mediating third figure, bringing the proletariat, if you like, and the gentry together and making them shake hands. Now, this was very resonant in Weimar-era Germany when the German Socialist Party was creeping up in terms of its success, and it was a real anxiety about how can we make the different segments of society work together. That can we find more that we agree on than we disagree on, and that was a profound anxiety for them. To me, Unger, so I'll spell out his basic idea before I do the Žižek. So Unger's basic idea is, as I say, a very commonsensical one, that we have all sorts of opportunities to create the kinds of political spaces and temporalities and ideological strains that whatever we want to create, we can. You can call it maybe the kind of the Disney version of political philosophy, that we just have to try. We have to try our best, that we can engage in political structures, that by adding a little bit of ourselves into the mix, we can all together kind of bake the kind of cake that we would want to eat, that you just have to try, essentially, that if you don't try, you'll never know. And so it's a kind of an evolutionary response to Marx, that we make our history, but not always in the time of our own choosing. He's very much within that tradition of the kind of path dependency thing, that society is there to be integrated with, that Unger's response to the question, is power all-consuming? Unger's response would be, no, not really. Like, it can be, but if you are clever about engaging with it, then it rarely ever is. It rarely ever is as all-consuming as it seems to be. So I'm glad I've rattled through that quite quickly, because although I'm aware that that resonates nicely with what Michael and Torsten were saying about trade unionism and the value of kind of collective bargaining and the value that can have within the social dynamic. I'm very much on board with that, but I want to spend this time spelling out the completely opposite view, which I think has value even on its own terms, even as an intellectual exercise, which is Žižek's view. So to try and get at it, as I said, slowly, a little bit slowly. Žižek does, or in the book on Hegel, which I don't know if anybody's read, he does a whole chapter on like science, quantum physics, and so on. And he kind of paints the picture of the atom, and he says, okay, what is the atom? What did quantum physics in the the 30s discover the atom to be? It's its smallest level of microscopic kind of magnification. The atom is essentially mostly a void. That there's actually nothing there. That it's what he calls less than nothing, because the kind of physical space is actually a huge void held together with kind of charge, like what he calls negative charge. So it's like a nothingness where everything's a line pointing the same way. So developing that a little bit, he has the same conception for society. He has the same conception for society. So what I'd like to try and do now a little bit, if I can, is draw a line, however difficult, try and draw a line between German idealism 200 years ago right through to now and Žižek. So I'm going to read a quote in a minute from the Hegel book, the Žižek book on Hegel, which I think is fascinating. So hopefully this kind of image just starts you off that we kind of, Nietzsche would have said that we build our societies on the edge of volcanoes, that void that the Copenhagen school of quantum mechanics identified at the level of the atom is also formally true at a conceptual level socially. That our societies essentially gravitate around a nothingness, around the kind of abyss that Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer is gazing into. That essentially we all gravitate around. Good way to explain this is through Alain Badiou. So Alain Badiou would say, is an election philosophical? By and large, Alain Badiou would say no. Philosophy is where you have what he calls a non-commensurable relationship between two different social elements. So if you have an election, there's an implicit agreement there that if one party loses the election, then they'll cede the political space to the party that's won the election. So what Badiou would say is essentially that the disagreement over policies or whatever it might be actually cloaks a fundamental tacit agreement about the rules of the political game, that there really is no kind of non-commensurability there, that everyone can talk to each other, everyone can relate to each other, everyone knows the game. So famously, Badiou hasn't voted since '69 because he I haven't really read into this, but obviously there what happened in '68. Badiou famously hasn't voted since '69. I imagine he would say that he hasn't had a choice since 1969. What Heidegger and people after him would call the foreclosure of the political space would probably leave Badiou feeling like he has no one to vote for. And here you have the kind of the cynicism that has already been a theme this afternoon, and I'm sure we can talk about a lot longer. So I'm going to read this bit from the Hegel book. I really like it. I hope you do too. So, there's a little bit of jargon in this, which I can develop. We're quite happy to develop, but hopefully it speaks for itself. So, Žižek says the following in the Hegel book. What the inexistence of the big other signals is that every ethical and/or moral edifice has to be grounded in an abyssal act, which is, in the most radical sense imaginable, political. Coming back to Badiou a minute, but Badiou would say that the true election is not about participation within some kind of commensurable space, but it's a contestation about the space itself, what someone like Heidegger might call the ground on which politics is built. So to reiterate, it's not negotiation within a conceptual space, it's a negotiation over what that space even entails. And we might think, coming back to Metropolis, we might think about the kind of the messy ground of 20s and 30s European politics as a good example. It's far more bipolarized. We can even think back to Thatcher maybe. The issue seems far more to be about what kind of debate we're even having rather than about pragmatic, technocratic decision making. So, the idea that one can ground politics in ethics, or that politics is ultimately a strategic effort to realise prior ethical positions, is a version of the illusion of the big other. From the question, which ethics fits psychoanalysis, we should therefore pass to the question, which politics fits psychoanalysis? With regard to politics, Freud's ultimate position is the same as Lacan's. Psychoanalysis, so maybe a little bit of what I'm trying to do here, a kind of psychoanalytic diagnosis of society, what Derrida does. What psychoanalysis does not provide is new positive political programs for action. It doesn't claim to, formally it can't. It can't possibly. What it does do, its ultimate achievement, the bottom line of its analysis and French theory, continental theory, is to have discerned the contours of a negativity, a disruptive force which poses a threat to every stable collective link. Since a political act intervenes in a state of things, simultaneously creating instability and trying to establish a new positive order, one can say that psychoanalysis confronts us with the zero level of politics, a pre-political, transcendental condition of possibility of politics, a gap which opens up the space for the political act to intervene in, a gap which is saturated by the political effort to impose a new order. In Lacanian terms, psychoanalysis confronts us with the zero level at which nothing is taking place but the place itself, while politics proper intervenes in this place with a new master signifier, imposing fidelity on it, legitimizing us in enforcing on reality the project sustained by this master signifier. I'll go into three models Žižek throws up, centered around this abyss, this formal abyss which grounds the social body itself. So one is what he calls the conservative approach with a small c. So the conservative reaction to the gap is to the abyss that the guy is staring into, is to become obsessed with it, to try and eliminate it, to essentially paper over the cracks. The second model is what Žižek calls the liberal model of approach, where we celebrate all the different kind of conceptions of the gap and try and mediate between them. Again, a lot like what some of us were saying a little bit earlier. But the third position, and the one that Žižek privileges, and the one that I kind of want to throw myself behind now, is what he calls the Maoist position. Now, this, of course, doesn't have to be historically specific to Maoist China. He's putting a kind of a label on it, just in order for us to be able to identify it and then embody it in whatever kind of temporality and space that we find it. But the Maoist conception of the abyss, which formally constitutes the social body, is that approach which recognises and agrees with, maybe, the kind of psychoanalytic point that I've just tried to make, and essentially becomes obsessed with it in a very open way. and fixates upon it. From here you get Mao's concept of permanent revolution, all the kind of exciting, all the kind of conceptual flourishings that Žižek does identify as having happened in Maoist China. So when I gave this talk, as I say, about a month ago in Scotland, I ended up saying, well, okay, so is power all-consuming? Yes. So what do we do then? And I think I ended up saying something like, I ended up putting a lot of stress on the kind of emphasis that Žižek makes about political silences, that essentially, borrowing a lot from Foucault, Žižek borrows that from Foucault, that silences can be very enabling. So in terms of that Maoist almost embrace of the gap, the celebration of the gap, that we essentially, unlike the kind of the truce makers in the first photo, that we don't try and solve problems, that we essentially fixate. We fixate on how much we fundamentally disagree. We identify and we carry with us what someone before called the inherent violence of the process, that we recognise that social mediation has not ever been and can never be about finding a safe ground, that essentially the safe middle does not exist. I could quite easily talk a lot about Kant and how there's how the parallax kind of, the middle ground that does not exist is it's a negative in our vision, that there is an absence where the safe middle should be. So, as I say, when I gave this talk about a month ago, I ended up stressing, that we should dwell on silences, and we should fundamentally not try to solve problems. And I remember that invited a lot of stuff back to me about ecology, and people were saying, well, that's just arrogant. That's just elitist and arrogant, because we do nothing. We're gonna suffer all forms of consequence. And at the time I argued back, but yeah, it was probably very right. So there's a good bit that I'll read to you to finish off with. In another book that Žižek wrote in 2012 called The Year of Dreaming Dangerously, where he manages to take the kind of psychoanalytic point that I've just tried to make about society and manages to condense it into maybe a few conceptual innovations about political praxis and the way to navigate the all-consuming nature of power and the way that the chain of signification works. So I'll find the book and I'll read this to finish off. Okay. So Žižek says, we should turn around the usual historicist perspective of understanding an event through its context and genesis. Radical emancipatory outbursts cannot be understood in this way. Instead of analysing them as part of the continuum of past and present, we should bring in the perspective of the future, taking them as limited, distorted, sometimes even perverted fragments of a utopian future that lies dormant in the present as its hidden potential. According to Deleuze in Proust, people and things occupy a place in time which is incommensurable with the one they have in space. The famous Madeleine is here in place, but this is not its true time. So we're all sitting here today. For Heidegger would say that the possible ranks much, much higher than the actual, that there are links through temporality and space that are working in very mysterious ways. So the upshot of this is that dwelling on the kind of the formal constitutive gap that structures the way that we relate to each other socially can bring a new kind of bravery, really, that we have to be prepared. I think, I'll put myself behind what Cullen was saying earlier, that we have to be quite happy with division, and we have to be quite happy with putting ourselves in situations where we know it's not exactly going to be a picnic, because that is all that will ever work. So Žižek's got quite a nice one about people tend to say if you want to make an omelette, you have to break some eggs. So Žižek said, well, what would Hegel say about that? Hegel would say that it's the leap that comes first, right? It's the jump that comes first that constitutes where you're going to land. So for Hegel, Hegel would say that if you want to break some eggs, in the end you have to make some omelettes. That it's the egg breaking, not the omelette making, that counts. It's the chaos. It's the destruction. Now this probably sounds like, you know, the same student stuff but I really believe in it. I think it's a very interesting way to think about it. That dwelling on this nothingness, if you like, can inspire us to different kinds of political bravery that don't have to end in programmatic bullet point programs, that don't have to end in 5-year plans, that they can end in the creation of temporal and spatial places where someone like Rothko would say that we all have to find these pockets of silence where we can root and grow. And he said we all have to hope that we find them. So that's it. I'd really like to hear what you guys think about Žižek and the kind of things that I've been developing. Thanks very much.